Before the video proper starts, I just wanted to remind you that the Casual Historian 2024 audience survey is still accepting responses, and it is linked down in the description below. So if you are a regular viewer of this channel and you haven't filled out the survey yet, I would appreciate it if you did. So for now, let's get on with the video. May 8th, 1945 was celebrated around the world as VE Day, marking the end of the war in Europe and the formal surrender of Nazi Germany. Given the movement of manpower and resources, this had truly been a worldwide effort, with even the colonies of European powers giving to the war. The Muslim community of Sétif, Algeria, a French colony, sought to commemorate their own war dead, which had been approved of by French authorities. But the messaging of the event wasn't confined to jubilations over the defeat of fascism. Some groups of paraders carried banners saying, "Long live free and independent Algeria." French police attempted to confiscate them, which escalated into violence. There were far too many Muslims in the crowd for the meager police presence in Sétif to control. Many in the parade had been carrying weapons, and when fighting with the police broke out, these people erupted from the crowd, charging into the European neighborhoods, indiscriminately shooting, loudly proclaiming jihad against the foreigners. Homes and businesses were burned down, and over 100 Europeans would be killed, and dozens of women were raped. The French army would enact brutal reprisals against the Muslims of Algeria. French soldiers rampaged through Muslim neighborhoods. Planes dropped bombs on Muslim villages, and ships fired on coastal towns. The death toll of these attacks is estimated to be anywhere between 1,000 on the low end and 45,000 at the high end. These events, known as the Sétif Massacre, are what many Algerians will tell you was the true beginning of the Algerian Revolution. Of course, the French had their own name for this confluence of events, which they call the Algerian War, but the rest of the world, we typically just call this the Algerian War of Independence. This is one of the most deceptively influential conflicts of the 20th century, even though it goes under the radar in the US due to Vietnam. This conflict created the Fifth Republic of France, which is still standing to this day. It had a radicalizing effect on the political left, with the works of Frantz Fanon being used to justify all forms of violence by oppressed peoples against oppressors, such as the waves of anti-Semites justifying the October 7th attacks by Hamas. Algeria would become a home for radical groups in exile from their home countries, all the while being one of the most religiously conservative countries in the region. So let me tell you the story of the Algerian War of Independence. Algeria had been a nominal part of the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century. However, it gradually asserted its autonomy over time and was functionally independent by the 19th century. But its independence would end in 1830 with a French invasion. And although there was resistance to French control, nothing that we today would recognize as an Algerian identity existed, which meant that most resistance to French rule came from local or regional movements. After the overthrow of the monarchy in the 1848 revolutions, the Second Republic would legally incorporate Algeria as part of France. It was divided into departments like France proper and elected representatives to the National Assembly. But the Muslims of Algeria didn't have citizenship and thus couldn't vote in these National Assembly elections. Although the Algerian War would become noted for its brutality, this was nothing new in French Algeria. In fact, the numerous repression campaigns of the 19th century led one French investigator to say, "We have surpassed in barbarism the barbarians we came to civilize." Emperor Napoleon III would try to further incorporate the Algerians into the French Empire on equal grounds as Frenchmen, once saying, "I am as much the emperor of the Arabs as of the French." But his overthrow after the Franco-Prussian War would see authority in Algeria handed over to civilian colonial officials, who were more concerned with European supremacy than lofty ideas of multiracial empire. One of the biggest complaints about French colonialism would be the distribution of land between European colonists and native Berbers and Arabs. Under Ottoman rule, there technically wasn't any private land ownership in Algeria, as it was all owned by the Sultan in Constantinople, who then gave authority to administer it to the Deys and other local officials, but retained the legal right to take it back and give it to someone else. When France took over Algeria, they operated under a legal theory that the French government had assumed all the rights and privileges of the Sultan in Algeria, including the ownership of all lands. They would then encourage people to colonize Algeria by offering cheap land, with the most fertile reserved for Europeans. By 1919, European settlers owned 215 million acres of land, compared to the 18.5 million owned by Muslims. As for the people of Algeria, France had adopted an assimilationist policy, trying to make the Algerian Muslims more culturally French. But citizenship was restricted to men who were willing to forsake all other local identities and affiliations. This was the only way for Muslim men to get jobs in the civil service and rise through the ranks of colonial Algeria. And although Algeria would eventually be given their own legislative assembly, it had little authority over domestic affairs. Luckily, you can take control of your own international affairs with this video's sponsor, Sétif. If you've ever traveled abroad, then you know that your domestic data plan usually doesn't work, and trying to get a foreign data plan can be a bit of a hassle. Well, that's where this sponsor comes in. Nord Security, the company that brought you other services such as NordPass and NordVPN, have brought you a new service, Sétif. From the Sétif app, you can choose from a number of affordable eSIM plans from over 160 different countries that can provide you the data you need when exploring the world. It helps you save time by not having to get a local SIM card, and it helps you avoid scams from fake SIM cards being sold outside of trains and airports. All of their data plans are compatible with both iOS and Android, and they have 24/7 support to give you the help you need when abroad. Setting it up is simple. Just download the app and select from the numerous plans covering over 160 countries, which include options for the amount of data you want as well as how long your trip is going to be. And the viewers of this channel can get a 15% discount on their plan when they use the code CasualHistorian at checkout. I'm hoping to do some travel in the near future, and you can bet that I'm going to be using the Sétif app for any of my eSIM card needs. So go ahead and click the link down in the description below and try out Sétif today. Thanks again to Sétif for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. Prior to the Great War, most identities in the colonial world were based around local tribes, clans, and religious communities. But as men were recruited from the colonies to go fight or work in Europe, they became exposed to various forms of European nationalism, which would shape their own ideas of national identity. Algerian workers in France would be exposed to protests from the working class French, as well as anti-French propaganda from the Central Powers, along with Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination. And those that returned home after the war would bring these ideas back with them. Algerian nationalism continued to percolate amongst the Algerian elites through the interwar period, and by the time France fell in 1940, they were divided, with some supporting the Germans in hopes their shared anti-Semitism and anti-communism would align well with the Nazis, and others opposing both French colonialism and German fascism. The French Algerians were supporters of the regime of Marshal Pétain and Vichy, and went along with revoking rights for Algerian Jews who had gained French citizenship. However, the French Algerians were quick to change their tune after the US invaded Algeria in 1942. Charles de Gaulle would arrive in May 1943 and set up his provisional government in Algiers, and in the process granted citizenship to tens of thousands of Muslim Algerians, thus giving them equal access to public jobs. Algerian elites began making calls for Algerian autonomy after the war, with its own constitution and legislature. And the colony would suffer from famines during the war, which would trigger peasant revolts in rural areas, as well as protests declaring, "Down with fascism and colonialism," which was often met with force by French authorities. This was the context that led to the Sétif massacre in 1945. Despite this, the Fourth Republic would be established in 1946 with a new constitution that would finally declare all Algerians to be citizens. But this would be undercut with the two-college system, meaning that the French Algerians and Muslim Algerians elected separate but equal-sized delegations to the National Assembly. This was seen as inherently unjust, considering the French Algerians only accounted for 10% of the population. In fact, let's take a minute to look at those demographics. In 1954, the European population of Algeria had grown to just shy of 1 million, with 79% of them having been born in Algeria. A good chunk of that population were Alsatians, who immigrated to Algeria after Germany annexed Alsace in the Franco-Prussian War. There were also large cohorts of Corsican and Pyrenees, along with immigrants from Spain, Italy, and Malta. The Arabs and Berbers had a higher birth rate than the Europeans, and it was only the higher death rate for Algerians that kept the Europeans from getting completely swamped. The death rate of Algerians had begun to lower in the 20th century thanks to the introduction of modern sanitation in urban areas. However, beginning with World War II, the standard of living for Algerians began to decline, and this continued into the 50s as revolts spread across the country. And this was despite a concerted effort by France to invest more in Algeria. The average European in Algeria had an income 15 to 20% lower than their counterparts in the metropole, with their economy mostly limited to exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods from France. And whatever downsides the French Algerians were experiencing, you can just assume that the Arabs and Berbers were experiencing a worse version of it. The Fourth Republic instituted an industrialization plan for Algeria that involved building more transportation and communication infrastructure, as well as providing loans for farmers to buy mechanized farming equipment and fertilizer to increase food production. But most of the income growth was concentrated in the cities. This growth in the urban economy drew in a lot of Muslims, who ended up living in shanty towns and slums on the outskirts of Algiers, competing for jobs with lower-class French Algerians. And resistance to French hegemony didn't begin in Sétif. Prior to the 20th century, most of the resistance to French rule was local, but the early 20th century would see a religious revival in North Africa, which coincided with increased birth rates. Islamic fundamentalism was so strong in Algeria that after independence, there would be lynch mobs targeting people not following fasting laws during Ramadan. Some Algerian Muslims believed that they could modernize Islam with European science, but the French colonists would continue to advocate for restrictions on Algerian rights, as well as continued separation of European and Muslim communities. There were also a large number of immigrants from Algeria moving to France, with at least 740,000 moving to Paris between 1947 and 1953 alone. They tended to concentrate themselves in a handful of neighborhoods, which the Paris police would patrol with a special brigade. This brigade had collaborated to a high degree with the Gestapo and the Vichy regime, and thus after the liberation of Paris in 1944, it was dissolved. This Algerian diaspora would become a crucial factor of the war with France, on top of the exposure to European ideas like nationalism and socialism. And the man who is often considered either the father or grandfather of Algerian nationalism, Messali Hadj, would be vital. Messali came from a working-class family in Algeria and would go to the university in Paris, where he would make common cause with French communists who helped him found his publication Étoile Nord-Africaine, which doubled as a socialist independence organization, first advocating independence for Algeria in 1925. Most Algerians who did vote in French elections, both in France and Algeria, tended to vote for socialist parties. However, by the late 1930s, the Algerians began to flirt with fascism, with Messali Hadj himself aligning with the French fascist Jacques Stora, who, similar to Hadj, had been a communist in his youth. But this realignment wasn't enough to protect Hadj or his followers, who would be hunted by the Nazis for their past communist activities. However, after World War II, Messali would become a moderate voice in the Algerian independence struggle, opposing the violent means of the more radical groups, and would subsequently be accused of being an asset of French intelligence services. After the Sétif massacre, he would found the Movement for the Triumph of Democratic Liberties, MTLD, which actually managed to win seats in the Algerian Assembly. But by 1954, Messali himself came to blows with the Central Committee of the party and was estranged from its leadership by the time the War of Independence began. Another voice of importance was that of Ferhat Abbas, who, in contrast to Messali, was from a wealthy conservative Algerian family, who would be more motivated by Islam than by socialism or nationalism. Abbas received a thoroughly French upbringing and didn't really believe in an Algerian identity. Had I been able to discover an Algerian nation, I would be frankly and unashamedly nationalist. But I am not going to die for an Algerian fatherland because such a fatherland doesn't exist. I have been looking for it and could not find it. I have questioned history. I have questioned the living and the dead. I visited the cemeteries looking for it. Nobody even talked about such a thing. However, Abbas would begin changing his tune during World War II after having been exposed to American conceptions of anti-colonialism, and signing a 1943 manifesto calling for the self-determination of Algeria. And in 1946, when the French Senate voted against an amendment that would grant citizenship to all Algerians, he founded the Democratic Union of the Algerian Manifesto, UDMA, which advocated for an autonomous Algeria within the French Union. Now, the fact that there were so many different Algerian groups advocating for independence shows you the divisions within the nationalist movement of Algerians. And these various rival groups were active in both Algeria and France, with the streets of Algerian neighborhoods in Paris becoming the sites of shootouts like gangs fighting over turf, which French authorities wrote off as being fomented by either Moscow or Cairo. The individual groups had trouble maintaining cohesion as well. Disputes over direction of the party led Messali Hadj to leave the MTLD, with his followers, called the Messalists, joining his exodus. Also breaking off from the MTLD was the Special Organization, OS, founded by a former army sergeant, Ahmed Ben Bella, which advocated for more aggressive tactics and would be joined by a former member of the Chamber of Deputies, Mohammed Kadir. Their early years focused on isolated terrorist attacks and bank robberies, with French authorities eventually chasing them out of Algeria, forcing them into exile in Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. all the while keeping in contact with their allies in Algeria. 1954 would be the big turning point that would transform this movement into an armed insurrection. This year saw both Morocco and Tunisia promised eventual independence, along with the invasion of French India by Nehru, as well as the defeat of French forces at Dien Bien Phu. And I would like to take a minute to thank the forces of my Patreon for helping keep this channel afloat this year. And in particular, I'd like to thank my newest patrons, John, Eden, Eli, and Stuart. The support of the patrons help keep the lights on here when the algorithm doesn't feel like giving us a fair shake. And in return for their support, patrons get a number of perks, such as getting to watch these videos early, ad, and censor-free. They also get access to a patrons-only Discord server, as well as the notes and the scripts I use to make these videos. But at the end of the day, most people who support content creators on Patreon tend to do so because they like what that patron does, and they want to see them make more. And so the perks are just kind of a way for us creators to thank you guys and show our appreciation. And so to all of my patrons, past, present, and future, thank you. But for now, let's get back to the history. This chain of events gave the impression that the French Empire was on the verge of collapse, and the victory at Dien Bien Phu gave examples of how a colonial peoples could militarily defeat the French. On top of the political inspiration, thousands of soldiers who had fought for the French in Vietnam were from North Africa, and after the war they were returned home, where many of them would go on to start or join armed rebel groups. 9 men, most of whom were veterans of the French army, would go on to found the National Liberation Front, or FLN. The FLN spent months recruiting fighters, organizing cells, and procuring weapons, mostly a hodgepodge of old German weapons, pistols from the Vichy regime, and anything left behind from the Americans. On the night of October 31st, 1954, the cells gathered at their meeting spots across Algeria and readied their weapons. The cells were supposed to attack simultaneously across the whole country at 3 a.m., November 1st, but some attacks happened prematurely, which allowed earlier targets to alert others beforehand. There would be about 30 attacks across the country via homemade bombs and commando raids, targeting a combination of transportation and communication infrastructure, military installations, government buildings, and civilians. But in addition to targeting the French, the FLN also targeted any Muslim collaborators who were referred to as the Beni Oui. After the attack, the rebels had a proclamation broadcast from an Egyptian radio station, as well as distributed as pamphlets across the region. To the Algerian people, to the militants of the national cause, after decades of struggle, the national movement reached its final phase of fulfillment. A group of responsible young people and dedicated militants, gathering about it the majority of wholesome and resolute elements, has judged that the moment has come to take the national movement out of the impasse into which it has been forced by the conflicts of persons and influence, and to launch it into the true revolutionary struggle at the side of the Moroccan and Tunisian brothers. Our movement of regeneration presents itself under the label of Front de Libération Nationale. The All Saints' Day attack would kill about 7 people and ultimately failed to achieve the social and economic disruption that the FLN had hoped for. But it did set in motion the events that would lead to a conflict in which, to be quite frank, we are still uncertain about the casualties for today. One of the first things French authorities did after the attack was to outlaw the MTLD, from whom most of the attackers had ties to, but they were ultimately a moderate voice in the Algerian movement, and it would be the FLN that benefited most from its closing. Much of the leadership of the MTLD would be arrested, with the few that evaded the authorities, along with much of the rank and file, having to go into hiding in Algeria and abroad. Most of these members would join up with other paramilitary groups, with the lion's share joining the FLN, who brought their weapon caches with them. In order to win over some of the former MTLD members, Messali Hadj would form a new group, the National Algerian Movement, MNA, in December, advocating for independence on cultural and religious grounds. The French had believed the weapons for the FLN came from Egypt or the Soviet Union, believing the Algerian Muslims were not sophisticated enough to procure the arms on their own. Prior to the attacks, there had been under 50,000 troops stationed in Algeria, but by February 1955, that number would grow to over 83,000. With the Interior Minister and future President François Mitterrand deploying an additional 3 paratrooper battalions. Coincidentally, the War Minister, Jacques Chevalier, was already in Algeria at the time of the attack, thus smoothing the process. Responding to the FLN's demands of immediate and unconditional independence, Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France said, "Algeria has been French for a long time, Therefore, secession is inconceivable. One of Mendes France's final acts as premier, before his government fell to a no-confidence vote, was to name a new governor for Algeria, Jacques Cousteau, who would be tasked with implementing reforms to blunt anti-French sentiment amongst the Muslims. There are many ways of interpreting history, and the most popular at that time, and to an extent still very popular today, is a materialist view that takes this idea that conflicts are all about fights over resources. Well, the idea being is that, well, if you can ameliorate the material concerns of a minority population, you can prevent them from resorting to violence to address these inequalities. And this was the view that the French Social Democrats would take in the 1950s. If we could simply raise up the economic status of the Algerians, they will have no reason to revolt against us. Upon arrival in Algeria, Cousteau would travel the country to get a first-hand view of the situation on the ground, where he would see the crippling poverty of the Arab and Berber populations. He also discovered the areas where Algerian nationalism was most intense were also the areas with the lightest touch of French administration, some regions having only a single official. These observations led Cousteau to advocate for a change in policy orientation for Algeria. For decades, there had been a debate over whether to assimilate the Algerian Muslims into the French society by encouraging the adoption of French cultural norms, or to coexist with the Muslims, allowing them to remain culturally distinct from the rest of France, but being fully integrated legally and economically into the country. The assimilationists had won the debate, but a persistent minority of officials continued advocating for coexistence, often referred to as a Dutch or British style colonialism. Cousteau began advocating not just economic development projects, but for administrative and political reforms as well. He draws out a plan to decentralize the administration of Algeria by creating new departments with more locally accountable officials. He also wanted to reform the two-college system that resulted in an underrepresentation of Muslims in both the Algerian Assembly and National Assembly. There were also programs to improve Muslim integration into the governance of Algeria by increasing access to higher levels of education, due to many government jobs being restricted to citizens with a certain level of schooling, which most Muslim Algerians lacked. This would be paired with public works projects creating manual labor jobs in an attempt to close the income gap between French colonists and the native population. These reforms were also paired with a plan to hunt down the rebels. Cousteau created an SAS corps to patrol the remote rural areas of Algeria and befriend the local population. The plan showed promise at first, with Interior Minister François Mitterrand forbidding the unwarranted bombing of suspected rebel villages. But the FLN would begin targeting these special SAS corps, as well as French civilians, in hopes the French would become more oppressive toward the Muslim population, thus pushing them into the rebel camp. The FLN strategy would succeed, with French oppression and reprisals escalating with the indiscriminate violence of the rebels. Even the special SAS corps meant to befriend rural communities would devolve into the same brutality as the rest of the army. The FLN began to step up the frequency and intensity of their attacks in spring of 1955, attacking the SAS patrols, stealing their weapons, and slaughtering livestock, and often defacing the remains of their victims. In the areas they controlled, the FLN enforced their own Sharia law, with bans on smoking and alcohol. In response to the uptick in violence, the troop count in Algeria would be brought up to 100,000, with new commanders brought in from the campaigns in Tunisia and Morocco. In April 1955, the National Assembly voted to give emergency powers to the military. This was used by the army in Algeria to displace locals and relocate them to settlement camps, which were often followed by the burning down or bombing of old villages in hopes of depriving rebels of shelter. This was followed by major sweeps of troubled areas by the army. The army would begin calling in reservists, who would be sent in to fight in Algeria, which would see the beginning of protests and riots against the war in Paris and Algiers. However, the French government and media would downplay the violence, referring to the events as the Algerian Affair. This policy would be reiterated by Prime Minister Guy Molot in 1956, minimizing the actual fighting. The rebels are operating mainly on the political and psychological levels. Purely military action is of only relatively minor interest for them. It is merely the basis for an infinitely broader propaganda campaign. He also fell in line with the materialist interpretation of the conflict, believing they could buy off the demands for self-determination with jobs and education. The government is determined to make a considerable effort in order to develop Algeria's economy and raise the standard of living of its population. It will wage war on poverty, but will not confine itself to that. To do so would be to resign itself to a kind of social paternalism and to disappoint a population which yearns for human dignity as much as for bread. But their refusal to publicly acknowledge the conflict didn't make it go away. As the FLN attacks intensified throughout 1955, Governor Soustelle was under increasing pressure to get results, while the army used the emergency powers granted to them by the National Assembly to enact policies of collective responsibility. When FLN fighters would damage communications infrastructure, the nearby village would be held accountable for it under the presumption that they were aiding the rebels and thus be forced to help rebuild it. And if an army patrol was ambushed by the FLN, said nearby village would have its population forcibly relocated and the village razed. Collective responsibility was justified by the French understanding of Arab culture, which believed such actions would demonstrate their strength and determination to the Arabs. But these tactics would be frequently criticized by comparing them to those of the Nazis. But the attacks by the FLN were also gruesome and indiscriminate, with the only difference between the two being the material capacity. And the push for sovereignty only intensified when Morocco and Tunisia were granted independence in November 1955 and March 1956. Algerian peasants, armed with axes, picks, and knives, would slaughter Europeans by hand, frequently slitting their throats, which was a sign of grave disrespect to Algerian Muslims. The French responded to such atrocities, especially in more isolated settlements, with private militias, who had their own penchant for brutality. And back in France, the wider population was not supportive of the anti-conscription protests, which were mostly constrained to the individual families impacted. Ferhat Abbas and the UDMA had remained on the sideline of the rebellion, continuing to play the moderate voice for independence. But as atrocities continued to mount, they would place their support behind the FLN in late 1955. The communists, however, had been politically aligned with the FLN from early on, though they initially chose to maintain their own separate political and military apparatus. But in the summer of 1956, the Algerian Communist Party would place its fighters under the control of the FLN. The Algerian Islamic authorities, the Ulama, would join with the FLN in January 1956, and in August that year, they, along with the UDMA, would be formally dissolved and absorbed into the FLN, which would be reorganized to accommodate its new coalition. They also drafted a new charter for the organization, in which they declared themselves the sole legitimate representatives of the Algerian people. This declaration would upset Massali Hadj and the MNA, who rejected their claim to represent the people of Algeria, and would continue to fight with the FLN in both Paris and Algeria, the levels of brutality often exceeding what the FLN and French did to each other. By 1962, 25,000 Algerians would be killed by this infighting. Arab League states, as well as the UN, would typically side with the FLN over the MNA, with the FLN being recognized by the non-aligned conference in Bamberg. Throughout the early war, French politics continued to be unstable. Pierre Mendès France's government had lost power in a no-confidence vote in February of 1955, and would be succeeded by Edgar Faure, who lost a confidence vote in November, with new elections in January bringing Guy Mollet to power. Mollet would replace Soustelle as governor of Algeria with Robert Lacoste. Mollet had initially planned to de-escalate the war in Algeria, but demonstrations by pro-war activists in both Paris and Algiers would lead to the premier rededicating his government to the war effort, while also downplaying its importance. By February 1956, there were nearly 200,000 soldiers in Algeria. The military divided the country into three zones: operations, pacification, and forbidden. The operation zones would see the army militarily defeat the rebels. The pacification zones were civilian areas the army would focus on defending, and the forbidden zone was to be depopulated, forcibly relocating the population to new settlements. And this mission was supported by the National Assembly, which would vote overwhelmingly to suspend individual rights in Algeria. After the FLN's first attacks on Algiers in March 1956, Lacoste would impose a curfew on the city, but the FLN would increase the rate of terror attacks across Algeria. All the while, the reservists were discovered to have been inadequately trained for operations. The French government came to the reality that in order to defeat the Algerian insurgency, they would need to cut off their supply lines, and the most prominent of these was Egypt, under the rule of Gamal Abdel Nasser. France wasn't the only country that had issues with Nasser's Egypt. The United Kingdom, who had been pressured out of the Canal Zone 2 years earlier, believed that Egypt couldn't be trusted with control of the Suez. And then there was Israel, who was still in a state of war with Egypt, who had been arming Palestinian militants in Gaza to launch cross-border raids into southern Israel. The French had begun covertly working with the Israelis on nuclear weapons development, eventually building them a reactor and processing facility near Dimona, while the French were busy prepping their detonation site in the Sahara in southern Algeria. You can watch this video to learn more about that. The French were certain the Egyptians were delivering weapons to the FLN, and they were positive that they were using the newly independent governments of Morocco and Tunisia. In March, the French intercepted a flight carrying several Algerian rebel leaders to meet with President Habib Bourguiba and Sultan Mohammed V. In talks between President Bourguiba and Eisenhower, Bourguiba had expressed his support for Algerian independence. In addition to this, the US and the UK had begun limited arms sales to Tunisia due to no one else supplying them with arms. But this upset the French, who believed that Tunisia was arming the FLN. These concerns would eventually lead France, Britain, and Israel to hatch a plan. Our French friends felt equal anxiety as to the effect of Nasser's propaganda upon their North African territories, especially Algeria. The fall of Nasser, by whatever means, would clearly relieve them of dangerous pressures. And although Eisenhower lacked sympathy for France and Britain's imperial ambitions, Eisenhower acknowledged Nasser's greater ambitions to expand his influence across the Arab world. His vision and, before long, his activities ranged far outside the borders of Egypt. France accused him of fomenting troubles among the Arabs in Algeria. The United States tried to abstain from these other quarrels, feeling that as a neutral, we might be helpful in composing differences. The public justification for French intervention in Egypt would come in October 1956, when they intercepted a ship carrying weapons leaving Cairo and headed for Algeria. I'm planning on making a video about the Suez Crisis at some point in the future, so here's the super short version of it here. On October 29th, the Israeli Air Force launches a series of attacks on Egyptian positions across the Sinai, followed by the IDF crossing the border. This would lead to France and Britain sending troops to the Suez Canal, under the guise of defending it from the fighting between Egypt and Israel. But the US and USSR would pressure the British, French, and Israelis to pull out. The failed operation to oust Nasser from power would force France to confront the insurgency in Algeria with a greater fury. By November 1956, there would be over 350,000 soldiers in Algeria, who had to deal with tens of thousands of Algerians in the FLN, who had taken control of several regions of the country. In November, Premier Guy Mollet would appoint a new general, Raoul Salan, as commander-in-chief, who would utilize his experiences from the First Indochina War to fight the insurgency in Algeria. But unbeknownst to outside observers, the violence in Algeria was about to drastically escalate, while the ultimate legacy of the conflict was about to be cemented in the Battle of Algiers. I want to thank Saley again for sponsoring this video. To get a 15% discount on an eSIM plan, just click the link down in the description below or use the discount code CasualHistorian at checkout. And if you don't want to miss part 2 on this series on the Algerian War of Independence, then make sure you click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to turn on notifications so you don't miss that video when it comes out in another week or two. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.